And good day all, this is Tehillim29 back again for another indie comic review. And in this indie comic review, or these indie comic reviews, I will be covering Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, Berzerker, issue 6, and King Spawn, issue 5. I'll now get things ready so I can cover the first indie comic which will be reviewed. So I'll be starting off with issue 2 of Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. And first things first, does this cover in any way, shape or form connect to something that's happening inside of the story? Sure enough, it does. To which I give this cover a 7.5 out of 10. I'll now show you some of the internal art before moving into the story and its aspects. So this is some of the art from the first part of the story, around the beginning. And as you can see, we have Sheena up against a leopard in the jungle. Not afraid to show her assets. But she also learns that there's something a little bit different about this particular leopard. Now moving into some art around the middle of the story. And she starts to learn a bit of a secret of something that's happening there. And last but not least, her next big encounter with that leopard again. As she starts to realize that the animals in some form of mind control. So for the internal art, I gave it a 7 out of 10. Now it's time to move into the story rating, to which it consists of references. Were there any references? What was the time covered in regards to this story? The location where it took place, and of course the cast of characters that we do end up meeting or having communications with. So first off, there were no comic references, so in that there were some points actually lost. In regards to time, we had several hours later, which sort of took place a little bit midway in the story. And last but not least, also towards the end, was basically the breaking of dawn, to which we got to see Sheena actually up in the trees, trying to spy out that leopard again. The location, of course, being the jungle that we ended up being introduced to in the first issue, but it wasn't pointed out once again which jungle it was. It would not hurt to include that, and in that it did actually lose some points. And the cast of characters consisting of Sheena, of course the person who hired her to go into the jungle, but we didn't get her name again. And in regards to that character's name should have been brought up back again, as it does feel like it's important to the story. And because of that, it did lose points. And a character that she was in communications with by the name of Patiti. Overall, I gave this story a 6.5 out of 10. There definitely needed to be improvement. Until then, let's move into the next comic that will be reviewed. So for the next indie comic that I'm going to be reviewing, it is Berzerker issue 6, as you saw earlier, when they were all lined up together. So let's start with first things first. Does this cover in any way, shape or form connect to something that happens inside of the story? Sure enough, it does, and I gave it a 7.5 out of 10. I'll now go to show you some of the internal art, as well as looking at some things in regards to the story before moving into the story racing. So moving into the first part of the story, and of course the artwork. Definitely enjoying the artwork. As we can see here, this takes place in the Ukraine. And of course we get a bit of aftermath of what happens in the 10 minutes later. Will be addressed later in the story issue, or in the story racing. As we jump to the middle of the story, we've still got the main character of B, or the Berzerker, or Unit, as it looks like he's starting to recover from some injuries and regenerate back again. And last but not least, some of the art towards the end, as it looks like we have some important items which we believe is connected to Unit's past, or B's past. With the internal art, I gave it a 7.5 out of 10. Now it's time to move into the story. Did we get any comic references, and did it affect the story rating? Again, no comic references, so in part it did actually affect the story rating. So in the area of time, what did we get in regards to time? We got 10 minutes later, and we got the time period of 800 AD, both in the winter and of course the spring, which I thought was really nice to be added to the story. We also got some other flashbacks, but they weren't pointed out when those flashbacks were. If they were a little bit further in the time period, such as were they in 1000 AD, 800 or 18, the 1800s or 1700s. That wasn't clearly pointed out. It might have actually been something memory related in regards to the character. It still wouldn't have hurt to include the time periods to which they occur. So in that it lost a little bit of points, because you did get to see Japan as well as some other places. Again, those locations also should have been pointed out. Moving into the area of location, the only location that we did get pointed out was Japan. There were a couple of other locations in the story, but they were not pointed out clearly, and clearly should have been. The cast of characters consisting of B, or Unit, to which you actually learn his name in one of the earlier issues, around issue 4, issue 5. We also meet Sorgan and Calantula, and last but not least, I think it was Gion. For this, it got a overall story rating of 7 out of 10. I'll now move on to the third indie comic that will be reviewed. So now it's time to move on to Kingspawn. And starting off with first things first, does this cover in any way, shape or form connect to something that's happening inside of the story? Sure enough it does, and I give it a 7 out of 10. I'll now show you some of the art, as well as show you some of the things that are happening in connection to the story before the story rating gets done. Starting off with art around the beginning. So this is some of the art around the beginning, and it's really nice because we do actually learn where this actually takes place. in the area of Botswana, and this is an Al Simmons here, but you do actually learn a interesting twist in this story. I'll get to it later on. And of course he's after someone by the name of Win. For we know, that could actually be his surname. I'll now move to the middle of the story. As we move to the middle of the story, we get Spawn himself up against a villain who we do actually learn is Jason Wynn. And this is some of the art towards the end. And I must admit, the art for Jason Wynn's costume is very interesting in appearance, as he looks like a right a-hole. Literally a pure a-hole. And look at the damage that's done here to this Spawn. I must admit, I am really impressed with the artwork in this series of King Spawn, to which I actually gave it a 7.5 out of 10. Moving into the story, did we get any story references before we move into the rating? No, we didn't. No, it wouldn't have hurt to include it, especially in regards to a little bit of confirmation in regards to something that was brought up in the story. Moving into the area of time, we got many years ago, and that connects to the location being Botswana. The cast of characters being Al Simmons, Win, who we end up meeting, Spawn and She-Spawn that were also shown, Terry, and last but not least, Jason Wynn. One interesting fact that you sort of learn in this is that there's also a second Al Simmons in this world, which makes one wonder, okay, who is it that they're wanting to crown to be this King Spawn? Is it the first Al Simmons, or is it the second Al Simmons? And this first one, we already know, doesn't want no bloody crown. You sort of like shove it up your rear end. I don't want it. But what do we know of the motivations of this second Al Simmons that became a Spawn? Does he actually want a crown? So, in essence, it seems to indicate that there might be a time differentiation in regards to the main Spawn storyline and this Spawn storyline. Well, until then, let's keep it colourful and have yourself an awesome day.